Welcome to the planning board meeting of June 15th, 2020. I'm going to call the roll. Alden Clark.
Here.
Beth DeLeo. Here. Bob Kaut.
Here.
Jamie Pennington.
Here.
Heather Rogers. Here. Rick Tainter.
Here.
Richard Yeager is absent. Don Walters is absent. Bonnie Sontag, I'm here. We've got Andy Port, Director of Planning, and Linda Guthrie, our note taker, and Jennifer Blanchet, our zoning administrator, will be joining us later. So let me go through the agenda. First, we have a public hearing continued from May 18th on 344 Merrimack Street for a 60 special permit. Then at around 7:30, we will be joined by the councilors for a joint public hearing with on the ordinance concerning short-term rental units. And when that's over, under general business, we're going to have planning board discussion about Waterfront West, minutes approval, and any other updates. So let's go straight to the public hearing for 344 Merrimack Street. I'd like to ask them to give us an update where you are right now. We did go through the draft decision last time, so we'll see if there are any updates in that and where that. So, now.
Thank you, Bonnie. Nick Bracknell for the record, 13 Picard Street, Amesbury. As an update for where we left off and where we are tonight, I think we had 3 issues that I was aware of, or I took in my notes that were outstanding items. The first being the landscape plan needing to be updated to reflect the landscape plan that was shown last to the zoning board of appeals that showed 4 street trees on Union Place, where we only, I think, had 2 in the latest landscape plan. So that's been updated and uploaded, and I have copies of it if you haven't seen it. But we expect that to be reflected in the record as the landscape plan of record for this project, should it proceed. The second item was in relation to the Historic Commission and the preservation restriction, and making sure that the Historic Commission had agreed with the final draft of the preservation restriction that we were presenting for the second or third time last Thursday when we went back. And when we got there last Thursday, there was one remaining outstanding issue related to the last paragraph of the preservation restriction, which pertained to a subordination clause that would make sure the preservation restriction is senior in rights to any mortgage or lien on the property. So it's not extinguished in the case of a foreclosure. We were presented with that issue from the commission at the meeting, and it was me in particular. I was the only one there, and I'm not an attorney. So what we agreed to do was work on it subsequent to last Thursday's meeting. As a result, I've gone back to Paul Gagliardi, who's the attorney for Brad Kutcher, the co-applicant here, and Sam Kimball, who's in the audience, is the owner of 344 Merrimack. We roped in his attorney, Doug Bullock, and between the 3, 4, or 5 of us, the issue was that this property currently and uniquely is a 2-family structure. And it has 2 units in it, and it's not a 2-family use. It's a condominium with a homeowners association. The Kimballs purchased the second unit 2 years ago. So they're the owner of record of both units. So they have 2 mortgages because they bought the first one a long time before they got there. Both the mortgage companies or the lenders are nowhere near Newburyport. So in order to get a subordination agreement from the lender, it could likely take us many months, if not longer, to get these people to do anything as a lender, because right now they're in first position because that PR is not on record. Paul's going to correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not looking at it. So what we've discussed with Glenn, and I believe Glenn will speak for himself. He's spoken with somebody at Mass Historic today about our suggested condition that we would recommend you consider if you can see this project moving forward, which is that what Sam and Michelle are going to do, should this project get approved and get through the appeal period, is they are going to have to refinance and create a new condo association. Their 2-family will become a single family. their interest rate in their mortgage will be a single family rather than a commercial loan, which it would be today. It's 2 condominiums. The condominium association will get dissolved and a new one will be established, and with the 2 single family homes and a new condo site plan and a new set of floor plans. All that stuff always happens when you're finished approving the project, except the subordination piece. We're suggesting that Sam or Brad, nobody gets a building permit until all of what I just said happens. And they go on record with the preservation restriction prior to a mortgage being assigned to the property, which will put the mortgage in first position, the PR in first position, which is what the city wants to be guaranteed. They can force it in case of a foreclosure, not see it disappear. Is that sort of right?
That's correct.
Okay. So the language, I'll just finish by saying the language that we were contemplating, and I apologize, I gave this very late this afternoon to Andy and Kate, is that the planning board approved the 6C should you approve it, with the stipulation that prior to issuance of a building permit, the preservation restriction be one, approved by the Newburyport Historic Commission, the city, whether that's the mayor or the council, I couldn't remember, so the city, and Mass Historic, all 3 entities would have to approve it. And that's the first part of the condition. The second is that the planning board and the historic commission will receive a certification from an attorney, probably that guy, that the PR has been recorded at the registry of deeds and that the PR is not subject to or subordinate to any existing or future mortgages or liens on the property. So it's belt and suspenders. And we ask that you consider that because it doesn't make sense for the Kimballs to either spend a year trying to get these companies in Timbuktu to figure out what we're doing in Newburyport and subordinate an existing mortgage, or them to go refinance as a commercial loan simply to put the PR in a senior position, knowing weeks later they're going to have to refinance again to change that mortgage to a single family. If I haven't lost you, that's the gist. Does that make sense? Sort of. I got an education in last week anyway, but I wrote that down and I'll hand it out just in case you want to see what I wrote. It's really the first paragraph. The second paragraph I thought we could use with the historic commission next week when we go back there to finalize the same approach. You need it? Want to add anything? Okay. And I don't think we have any issues on the draft decision. That's the third. I know Glenn is here. Might want to add.
Yeah, Glenn, do you want to make your statement?
Yeah, very briefly, sure.
And make it up here. So
Yes.
remember, I'm like this.
I'm Richard, 6 Kent Street, report, also chair of the historical commission. So the, you probably got my memo from just the other day explaining that the PR was fine in every respect except for the last paragraph, which what Nick just said. I actually been confused myself about the subordination thing because I went back to look at other PRs and wasn't seeing it. Well, I was able to contact Michael Steinitz. He's the gentleman at Bass Historical Commission who goes through these with us and shepherds it through their process. And I asked him about it. I said, oh yeah, when we get those, we actually check at the registry to see if there's any prior liens or mortgages, whatever. I said, oh, okay, so none of those had it. I said, no. All right, so that explained that, why I wasn't finding it, but now I did. Like 342 American Street had a clause with a subordination agreement. It was a local bank in that case, I believe it was an institution. So that explained that. So I then explained to him that I'd been in touch with Mr. Packnell what his proposed solution was. Ran that through and how that would now give us a PR that had priority. It was the first thing that would be registered, followed by whatever other financial instruments or mortgages that they explained it to him. He said, yeah, that's fine. That would be fine with us. We would have no problem with it. So from my perspective, and I think that, and I always hesitate to say I'm speaking for the commission because they're not here, but I don't think the commission either would have a problem with saying that there's no solution since it does resolve the issue, would be fine. So that's it.
So the applicant is proposing a condition on the planning board that is connected to the issuance of a building permit. It includes PR being approved by Mass Historical and recorded in the Registry of Deeds. My understanding is that that process will take quite some time. And we were willing to just, I mean, our previous condition on there, and I'm doing this first before I deal with the subordination issue. We were suggesting that you have until the occupancy permit to actually record it, which would not hold up any building permit. So I'm kind of curious why you are suggesting this condition with all these three elements in it before a building permit issue.
That's a great one. Obviously, I didn't remember that, but I do have an idea or a thought.
You can go back to our condition if you want.
No, I mean, I think an occupancy permit is fine. I think the reason I chose a building permit was imagining Brad not wanting to proceed till this is closed out because the PR is on the second structure, not his. I think it's fine to leave the occupancy permit there, leave it at Brad's risk. He can work out an agreement with Sam on how they're going to secure their Brad's ability to move forward without that being concluded. But that's kind of the spirit I put into this, not expecting when I was standing here 2 weeks ago that 8 days later, I would have the issue presented. I had presented at the Historic Commission, which was this subordination clause. So it's kind of seat of the pants. This is definitely more restrictive than the occupancy permit. If you guys are comfortable with the occupancy permit, I think we are, because again, it's between Brad and Sam to make sure Brad's comfortable to proceed based on where that PR is with Mass Historic. And now that Michael has at least seen this language and we followed your template of 342 as requested by the Historic Commission. So we have no reason to believe anything will not get approved. So I think the occupancy permit will work.
Yeah, because this, our condition talks about acceptance of the draft PR by the Historical Commission before any building permit. In fact, the
Okay.
decision
Yeah.
cannot be made before that. So what I want to suggest is that, I don't know that we need to have this additional condition in here if we just let you go to the Historical Commission at their next meeting, get their acceptance of the language that they want to have in the PR, and come back to us for a decision. And just going the way it is with our draft decision.
I mean, we can do that. I don't think the PR is going to change because this language would be attached to the decision, the bottom paragraph, but the PR won't change. It's still only going to list the existing mortgages. It
Right.
won't have a subordination clause other than stating that the PR will be senior to any mortgage or lien on
Right,
property.
the subordination clause goes into the PR, right?
Yeah, it's already there. What we don't have is the letter, the sign on from the lender. That's the only thing we miss or lack that
But
342
my
has.
understanding is that the Historical Commission hasn't actually accepted. Our basic requirement is that they accept the draft.
I
preservation.
understand. And you're
We'd be
correct.
happy to take a vote once that's done.
Yeah.
And then we don't have to change anything unless other members have different views on that. I just wanted to.
We're good with that if that's what you want to do. Do you meet again in a couple of weeks or are we a month out?
July 6th.
Then I think let's do it the way you intended it to be done. And we'll ask for,
So does that, I guess my question is, does that get you, would you get everything done by July 6th? Because this would actually start, avoid the problem of having to go through all that rigmarole of finance and get rid of the condominium association. Do you have to do all that stuff or?
it'll all get done if you guys approve the project and the appeal period passes without an appeal, then all those things will go in motion. They will not start till we get through the appeal period, because if this project doesn't either get approved or it gets appealed and we lose the appeal, then we'd be wasting a lot of time and money preparing condo docs and everything in advance of that. The attempt I was trying to make with this paragraph was to be able to move forward tonight with giving the planning board assurance, understanding what was discussed 2 weeks ago was a little different. But we ran into this situation, and Glenn was here and he was gracious enough to reach out to Mass Historic. So I guess I was asking, but by no means demanding or anything, that the planning board consider approving the special permit with this language attached, which gives you full control.
I'm just thinking for future reference, we always separate out the acceptance by the historical commission of the draft PR, and then the rest of it, the formalized preservation restriction of Mass Historical and the registering of it goes in a separate condition, and it keeps it clean, and that's what comes.
And we're good if that's what you
I
want.
just want to keep with what has been working, and if we make something more complicated here, it might lead to other complications the next time around, when it's succeed or historical building.
So my question is, if we do, I don't have a problem doing it, but then we still have to come back to this type of, condition. I agree, it would have to be, we're saying perhaps before the occupancy permit, rather than building permit, but we still need to have most of item 1 and all of item 2.
Yeah, it would be,
So we're not.
but it's already in here, we already have it, we have the,
Can I speak to that?
yeah,
Yeah, I think this is a separate issue. The issue that Nick Rackhoff raised here is a separate one from the issues that we have addressed in the draft conditions here. I would suggest to the point we just discussed that we use this as an additive piece of language in the language we're putting here. So basically, in special condition 4, it talks about the fully executed and recorded PR. We would add the language about the subordination just to make sure that's very explicit in the written decision. But to the chair's point, part of what we try to do here is to make sure that any questions about the scope of the PR are resolved prior to the planning board issuing the special permit, because we try to encapsulate within there the substantive parts of what need to be preserved as part of the granting of this relief. So even though there has been some relief from the commission, there's reference to exhibit D. And so I think the assumption here is that there's not any ambiguity left by trying to close out here and still having some of that, unclosed. So to me, it does make sense to, perhaps finalize this language, confirm what's happening with the historic commission and the PR, and then close out with the planning board at a subsequent meeting quite cleanly, because everything is running correctly.
so basically keep what we have, add the subordination language to condition 4,
With occupancy being the
rest
new
of it.
term there. Yeah.
And all the dates, referencing the correct date when the historical commission accepts the draft. So, other than that, I can see anything else.
A couple of things.
Yeah.
We have new. We have new landscape plans, so on page 2, where we cite list the plans and documents. We should list L10, 0, L21, L22, dated June 13th, 2022.
What are they again?
That's the landscape plan and two landscape details, material details. So it's L10.0, L20.1, L20.2. And then the only other thing I saw was on page 4, there's a line struck out, and it's still there, so we should just get rid of that line. So
Yeah, the top paragraph. There was actually one more. What was that? Another document I was reading. Struck out.
I think you're right. Sure.
Page 3, so there's a sentence. At the bottom, page 3, two-family houses.
That's the one he just referenced.
Okay.
Yeah.
Our page is pretty.
Oh, got it.
I just thought there was a one word also that
I
had
think you're right.
a dash through it.
We'll call for that.
Okay. So, if everything is in order, with what we talked about tonight, these are clean, this is cleaned up. We'll have an even shorter session with you on July 6th. And we'll take a vote.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks for
That
your
work for
patience.
everybody? We need a continuance. A move for a continuance.
Make the motion to continue to July 6th.
I'll second.
Now, call roll. Alden,
Yes.
Ben,
Yes.
Bob,
Yes.
Jamie,
Yes.
Heather,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes,
Bonnie, yes. Okay, see you on the last six. Thank you very much for.
Have a good night.
Councilor Cameron, is your committee here, or you want to wait till everybody gets downstairs?
I told them 7:30, so if you have some other routine business you want to handle,
Uh,
they are upstairs.
you know your routine business? Nothing's routine with us. No, we don't have. meetings. Now we'll take a brief recess until the councilors can join us. We're tied up in another meeting and get here for 7:30. One word.
Yeah. or maybe actually been.
Yeah.
We haven't listed the project, but the rest of the resolutions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Two and the others will-
So I think we're right there. Question.
We'll be up here.
We should sit up here? Anywhere.
We're kind of thinking you wait.
So,
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Hey, Christine, we're not sticking together. We're spreading out for safety.
You think we're gonna save you from whatever's coming at you? Yes. Another
We need to.
Yeah, yeah. Thomas brings up on the,
Christine and Connie, are they about to wrap?
They're about to move it to sustainable. They were just finishing up health and insurance. Right. Oh, so it's the other committee, the whole.
Should I text them?
Well, I made it a point to say that it was nothing against their budgets, but that we had the joint meeting, the joint hearing, so. You want to go how many? Yeah. Yeah. A couple of planning came down, but they're entirely fine with us starting and they'll join as soon as they're done. They said they're fairly close to being done with that. Yeah. So they'll just join as soon as they're done.
So,
They said, I asked if they were okay with us starting. They said, yes, they were.
That's great, but I'm probably like some because I don't audio proposal.
Let's wait. To see what's wrong.
I'm sitting up there, I can barely hear you, so there's some sort of.
Oh, turn that off. All right.
Could be a lot easier.
Just, here, then it starts. Oh, no. All right, this is not working.
Yeah, you can press the.
Yeah.
Testing.
Oh, I should.
Yeah, I think you got it right.
All right, so this is the opening of the joint public hearing, planning board and city council on short-term rentals, proposed ordinance. Our meeting is, as the planning board is already open, so I will hand it over to Councilor Cameron to open their part of the meeting. Take it over.
Thank you. I'm ready to take it over. Thank you, everybody, for being here. My name is Ed Cameron. I'm the City Council Chair of our Planning and Development Committee, and I'd like to open up our portion of the joint public hearing with the Planning Board. We're joined by committee members Christine Wallace from Ward 4 and at-large Councilor Connie Preston We will be having other counselors come down. They're upstairs at a budget meeting, which, believe me, is as exciting as this meeting is going to be. But they're wrapping up shortly. So we're in the middle of budget season, so it's been tough for us to get meetings scheduled. So we appreciate planning board, your flexibility about allowing us to come in a little bit later. That's been very helpful. And I'm going to turn it over in a second to our zoning administrator, Jennifer Blanchett, and also for just for a couple of points. We will open this up to public comment after that, and then planning board members and counselors can discuss where we're at. I'd like to just start a little bit by setting some context here. So I've been back on the council for this term, which started in January. And this is the sixth meeting, public meeting that I've been a part of related to short-term rental units. We started in February 16th, with a joint hearing with the planning board. We had a planning and development committee as a whole, where all councilors are able to participate on March 1st. We had a public meeting with a third-party company that helps municipalities monitor and oversee short-term rentals. That particular company was named Granicus. We had that meeting on March 9th. We had another planning and development committee meeting, committee of the whole, on April 26th. We had another planning and development committee of the whole on May 2nd, where we did make a number of amendments. At that point, we were thinking that it was going to come for a full council vote. We made a number of amendments that night, and there were also some other ideas thrown out about non-owner occupied usage of short-term rentals, and perhaps finding a way to allow Newburyport residents who were investor non-owner occupied to operate short-term rentals. And those late ideas, I think, and just sort of the time, we were up against a time limit in terms of the original joint public hearing, in terms of how long we had to make a decision, and we ultimately decided to hold off on a full council vote. I'm not sure how that would have gone. Zoning changes, people know, requires a supermajority. So 8 of the 11 have to vote for something in order to make a change. And I just think we weren't quite ready there. Again, with some new ideas coming in towards the end. So it was reposted, and we're back with you. So the clock has started again. I think from my standpoint, there were many meetings before this term that I was not a part of, because I wasn't on the council, but Council Wallace was here in that previous term. And I took a 4-year gap on the council, and I remember it was one meeting in 2017. So this has been, been talked about for a long time. So I'm hopeful that we collectively, as a city council, come to an agreement and shortly bring this to a vote sometime in the near future. And again, very much appreciate the planning board's participation and input in this. The two sponsors are here tonight. Councilor Jim McCauley from Ward 5 has really been a point person on this, and this was also sponsored by Ward 3 Councilor and Council President Shan, also here as well. And we may call for a little bit of a recap from Councilor McCauley shortly. So that's sort of the context for this. I'm going to ask Director Ford and Jennifer Blanchett if they want to make some remarks, and then maybe we could hear from Councilor McCauley. Apologies to the councilors that just entered. We're kind of tight on space up here, but we'll make the best of it. And we're using the microphones, so the recording will be correct. But we could hear from Andy or Jennifer.
If I'm not mistaken, I think it sounds like we want to perhaps hear from the sponsor first. Was there?
Councilor McCauley, do you want to make some remarks?
Does this work?
Yes,
Okay.
I'll go with that.
Thank you.
but it may not augment your voice in the room, so.
Be loud.
Trade
Okay. Can I just talk normally then? Can everyone hear me?
Okay. Thank you for considering this piece of legislation and ordinance for short-term rentals. It's culmination of a number of conversations that have gone on. I think the current draft that is there actually strikes the balance that we want, that we're looking for. And the balance is multifold. Because we've got a balance between residential uses and commercial uses. And short-term rentals is a commercial use in a residential area. We have a balance between neighborhoods and a business owner being able to do that. We have balance between flexibility in parking and flexibility in bedrooms and categories with, again, balancing the quality of life issues that affect neighborhoods. We have an area designated for investor properties, which is out in Plum Island, which is better suited to that than a tight-knit community. All of those, when you add them up and put pencils down, I think are well reflected in this ordinance that you see in front of you, because it does strike that balance. It gives everybody a little, they don't get a lot, everybody doesn't get everything, but they get a lot of what we can live with going forward. That's my opinion, and that's how we kind of struck that. We do think that there's going to be some benefits to the city to this in terms of the output and being able to standardize some things and being able to implement it with additional supplemental staff or a third party or something like that to be able to do that. We think it will be a benefit and will enhance the experience of folks who come to the city for one reason or another. The ordinance itself hasn't changed, so I'm not going to go through it, but it does have definitions. It does have regulations. It does allude to a licensing side that would also have process and penalties as well going forward. So with that, I welcome open debate. Thank you.
You, colleague, and from Chet.
Jennifer Blanchet, zoning administrator. I'm here before you with the information I'm going to put out there is just that information. It's not intended to be an opinion or in support or against. I do have the role of ultimately determining whether these, if something gets adopted, meet the ordinance that you will be looking at, or if nothing gets adopted, what we do with the units that exist now that don't meet the ordinance. So some of the questions that were asked last time that I did not have the answers to, I think specifically last time I met with the planning board, were how many units we have that are registered, what percentage of those are owner occupied, and that sort of thing. I have had the opportunity to look through that. It changes daily, but we do get a periodic report from Ethan Manning from the state. And it appears that there are about 80 or so units that are on the mainland that are short-term rental units that are registered with the state. I should have started by saying, because the intent is that Plum Island not have the regulation to be owner occupied and not have those onerous parking restrictions, most of those would meet the requirements regardless of what we adopt. So I sort of take those off the top. But the 80 that we're left with, I then further looked at, and about 2/3 of those are not owner occupied. So without an amnesty provision, as was discussed at the last council meeting, right off the bat, about 2/3 of those are not even eligible for licensing. Then when we go further to look at parking requirements, as the parking requirements were amended on the council floor last time, and as the ordinance is now before you, I think it's the May 2nd version, there are 3 types of units. One of them being, the first being the home share rental units, those units are, they function like single-family homes in that people come, they stay in them, and they are not simultaneously occupied by the owner and the guests. So right now, we're calling for no additional parking spaces. They just are what they are, and if they're grandfathered in, they're allowed to stay without additional parking spaces. Those would be okay. So as long as you could meet the fact that you lived there the right number of years, those particular units, the home sharing units, would be acceptable and permittable or licensable under the ordinance you're looking at. The second kind is an owner adjacent rental unit. Those type of units require one additional space in addition to whatever is required for the single family use. So maybe somebody in the south end has space for one more car on their property. I don't think there are a lot of them. I mean, I look at these properties all day long, every day. People are lucky if they have the required 2 spaces, most people. Then the worst case, and this is not intended to be an argument for or against, but just a statement of fact after analyzing the properties, but the limited share where an owner lives in their unit and they rent out rooms is actually the most restrictive from a parking standpoint. And some people have asked how many parking spaces would be required of those. If you were to rent out 3 bedrooms in your single family home, in addition to the 1 bedroom that you live in, so if you have a 4-bedroom home, you would be required 5 spaces. I don't know where those exist in the districts that we are looking to adopt short-term rentals in. They might exist in R1, but we're not allowing them in R1. So with that, there perhaps is an argument for, if people are looking, if you all, as you evaluate this, are looking to allow short-term rentals at some level within the city, not a huge number, we have about 150 that operate right now. If that's acceptable on the mainland, then perhaps there is some reason to discuss the amnesty provision a little bit more. Because I truly do think that based on the provisions as they're being presented, many of the existing units or many of the homes where we think these could happen, don't. If that's not a concern, then the ordinance is doing what it's intended to do. And it will severely lessen the number of short-term rental units that can exist legally within the city of Newburyport. Which brings me to the last point, legally within the city of Newburyport. We will continue probably to see people who operate them outside of these ordinances, and we will have to cross that bridge when we get there as to what it means to go after or shut down these uses. But zoning is a very slow tool to do that. So if we can't agree to this through zoning, to something that reaches a balance that Jim McCauley had spoken to, maybe my thought on balance is a little bit different based on this, but if we can't get there, then perhaps there's a way through just a very clear licensing and some simple changes to zoning. But I wanted to share that information. I didn't have it last time, and I do think it's relevant to your consideration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I asked for Jennifer to speak because she had submitted those comments to myself and one contact earlier today. So thank you for that. In report, and Andy in particular talked about Attorney Eichmann from KP Law, who gave advice on the possibility of Newburyport residents as non-owner occupied operators, and also I think what gets called grandfathering or amnesty, but allowing existing non-owner occupied operators to continue, but not allowing new folks in that category to continue to start up at some point.
Right, sorry, can you all hear me? Is that working? No? Okay. Yeah, so you have the ability to grandfather, so to speak, it's not really the right term here, but provide an amnesty provision, if you will, for the continuation of existing short-term rental units that are out there in the community, you know, parameters you may wish to define. KP Law, been looking at the option that.
Maybe watch the microphone.
Sorry?
Yeah, you
Yeah,
got it.
sorry.
Yeah.
Got it right there, sorry. With the respect to having residents or non-owner occupied short-term rental units in the community, KP Law essentially provided a caution that if you're trying to, where the short-term rental unit is on the property, there's a relationship there, an nexus for purposes of land uses between the primary use, the residential use, and the short-term rental unit being some subordinate or stemming from that. They would essentially suggest a little bit of caution if we're thinking about providing a restriction for those, allowing those in Newburyport to have a property elsewhere in Newburyport for the running short-term rental unit, but restrict others outside of Newburyport from doing the same thing. That the rationale, just to say that there's a relationship there between those two, or there was a sort of a public purpose being served by that distinction, becomes a little bit more tenuous in the sense of what they were communicating to us. Let that clarify.
Yeah, I do have it in front of me. It seemed to me it was a little more saying that there were legal issues around allowing that it could possibly be, in the city of litigation if we allowed, somebody to do X now because they've been doing X again in the mainland, but not allow folks to do it.
Again, this is all based on the assumption that someone might be challenging the ordinance. It is not clear, there's not a lot of case law this thus far. So people are providing suggestion that that's a potential weakness. Providing a suggestion that that might be a potential weakness, but we don't know until it's been, let's say, application of the ordinance.
On that particular point, I checked with the Salem example that one of our members had looked at and suggested in our recommendations that we do consider amnesty for existing non-owner occupied units. And it says very specifically that any it is not allowed to have any new non-owner occupied units. So the only for the existing ones registered in the state by a certain date. So those are two separate issues, that whether or not we can limit it to people who only live in Newburyport on property. That's off the table. But as far as being able to allow amnesty for currently existing ones, because Salem has it in their ordinance, I'm assuming we could adopt that as well. It just means that we could not in future allow any new non-owner occupied units to be moved.
Yeah, and I would add one thing to that too, and I think maybe perhaps, considerations you might want to keep in mind regardless of where the policy lies in front of your city council. The two public purposes I think I've heard primarily discussed over the last couple of years as we talked about shelter rental units is first off, and mostly we've heard about neighborhood impacts, sometimes disturbances in the neighborhood, one kind or another, and whether it's parking or noise or anything else. And so that has been the primary focus that I've heard over the couple of years we've been talking about this type of regulation being added to zoning. The other purpose that I've heard discussed a little bit more recently has been the potential impact on what we call middle layer units, the units that are in the city of Newburyport that are small, might be used as a short-term rental unit or provides revenue for someone as a short-term rental unit. And the idea that someone might choose to do the short-term rental unit and have turnover there at revenue rather than keeping that unit available for someone who's living here year-round or a longer-term basis. And therefore, the feeling that we might be jeopardizing the layer units that are needed in the community if we allow short-term rental units. The one comment I would make about that is just as I've seen difficulty over the last couple of years trying to reach consensus over the right balance for regulation of short-term rental units, is it would seem to me that the number that are out there today, that so-called or potential amnesty list, if you will, if you put aside for a second, there might be particular concerns that folks may have, with one or two of those, certainly heard a couple of those during the last couple of years, but I wouldn't say that's a significant number, that the office anyway, that concerns about. If that is a relatively small number of that inventory that's out there today, it's not, I guess it's not apparent to me that there's what the concern would be with allowing those to continue when they're not issues today per se. That's a policy choice, of course, one way or the other. But it's not, in my opinion, a significant number of units in the community. So if you were if you were to provide an amnesty provision of some type and allow those to be maintained, to Jennifer's point that she made earlier, it would seem to me that the majority of issues that have been raised about short-term rentals over the last couple of years could be addressed primarily with the licensing provision, in the sense that irrespective of, and I do think that the zoning piece could perhaps be simplified here for this particular use, consideration of the length of our zoning ordinance and how much once we put towards other activities within the community. That most of this can be addressed by the licensing provision, that if the license commission is required to issue a short-term rental license, and if someone does not obtain that license, there's an enforcement mechanism there, both in the under zoning enforcement as well as the license enforcement. License enforcement, actually, in my opinion, being much easier to pursue and to enforce, and more faster, I would say, than the zoning enforcement, which is a creature of the state statute and the applicable case law. That being the case, I don't know, the other alternative is that someone has got a license and then they have an issue of some sort. The license commission can then pull that license, and the need to have that license is also required under zoning, with a variation of the draft that we're looking at. So it seems to me that a fair amount of the concerns that I have heard raised about short-term rental units within the community or within the neighborhoods could perhaps be addressed a little bit more efficiently by having a license provision, requiring a license, pulling a license from someone who may not be operating, or if someone does not have one, enforcing from there. That's not to say that there aren't other avenues, and that certainly the draft of 5.2 of this year is one option of a way to go in terms of zoning and breaking down those categories and so forth, or in certain districts. But I don't know, it may be possible to address the issues that I've heard addressed today with short-term renters. It may be possible to do something that's a little bit simpler as a regulatory regime, which is a license procedure with some more simplicity in the zoning.
Okay. So those were updates from when we last were dealing with this, which for the council was in March. So now we'll take some time for public comment, and anyone would like to speak who is here, please go up to the podium. We'll be here until everyone can speak. So try to limit it to perhaps 2 minutes. State your name and your address.
Sure, Tim Smith, 53 Barbara Street. We run a rental that we've been experimenting in short-term rentals lately. And, I haven't revisited this issue for a couple of months, and I just got introduced to it. I guess my question is, our policy objective, your policy objective, I don't see how you can create one without a clearly defined and quantifiable section of problems. And so far, I haven't seen that done. Parking issues, whatever the problems we're talking about, I don't see that they've been quantified. Maybe they have, and I missed it. But I don't see how you create a policy objective, which this ordinance seems to be, without having that data in front of you. You talk about balance, and you talk about things like that. And what are we balancing? What are these problems that exist? I would like to see them, but I don't see them. And I've read the ordinance, and I don't know that it speaks. It seems to be a solution in search of a problem to me. And as far as licensing, I'm all for licensing. License the heck out of us. Register, put a fee in, we'll do whatever we can. I look at us as good actors, good for the community. Now, the issue to me is too many. If every other house is a short-term rental, we erode the community values that we so cherish here. And I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed. And that's, I don't know how we do that, but I think that's important. But we just seem to be layering these policies, and it's going to become so complicated. Enforcing them is going to be a nightmare when it's done, if it's done. And I don't see a clearly defined set of problems, and that's my biggest issue. And I'd love to see it. If it exists, please present it so we can see it. Maybe we can speak clearly and have a more clearly defined set of ordinances. It seems like we're doing ordinances for the sake of creating ordinances, and I don't see much value in that. But I know there's other considerations. I think we're very cognizant of that. We try to be the best actors that we can be, and I think that registration will create and disincentivize bad actors from existing. I think that's very important. along with some of the other issues, but speaking of ourselves, we regulate who goes in, we vet everyone. We keep our place, as I've said in an email to the planning commissions, it's naturally in our place. But again, that's no, I don't think, rationale to have these short-term rentals. More needs to be discussed, like I said, it can't be flooded with short-term rentals. One of the big issues to me is large corporate firms that want to create investment opportunities, and that's something that should be in the ordinance. That's an issue. They don't have the hands-on ability to create a community-friendly short-term rental. And I don't know if that's been discussed at all. Any of these.
Thank you, thank you, Mr.
20 minutes up.
I think so. Thank you. Thank you very much. Public comments?
Matthew Ainsworth, 77 Curzon Mill Road. Appreciate all your time, and I'm speaking on behalf of my better half, who normally is here in these meetings every month, talking about it. They all know Jennifer by now. But we own short-term rentals on the mainland, on Plum Island, and I own long-term rentals. I hear a lot of comments, I hear a lot of chat. I'd love you to come out and see mine, and then we can talk about the reality of parking, the relationship I have with all my neighbors in my properties, and then the damage it does in understanding the facts of perceiving what may or may not be true. I appreciate all the time that's been taken on this, and I appreciate everybody who's been listening to everybody speaking about it, because most importantly is to think about, what you're going to do to people who have heavily invested in buying these properties. We do them up. We spend a lot of money on keeping them in a very, very, very good manner for the town. And then allowing people to come and visit this town and spend time in this town that also generates a huge amount of revenue towards this town and helps, right? So the people who are coming here to see families, coming to events, wanting to spend time in Newburyport. It's got a big popularity. And we have people come from all over the world to come see this town. You'll remove that if you remove those properties. So I do like the fact that I'm now hearing that you're thinking about an amnesty in place for the properties that already exist. I'm all for registration, like Tim. I'm all for licensing. I think every single house should be picked and understood. I don't think we even understand how many there are, right? Being on the island as long as I have, I know how many properties are rented that are not licensed, are not registered. So seeing that and knowing it all and how it all operates and works will be a big deal for this town to understand what's actually going on. But to come and see some of these properties and see some of the neighbors who live next door to these properties who are pleased with what they've seen done to these houses that were either being torn down, rebuilt into big, much bigger houses with no parking. And by the way, Jennifer said, there are houses on top of houses on top of houses I've tried to buy in this town that have no parking. Sorry, I appreciate it. I appreciate all the work you've done though. And these people have tirelessly been at it for months and months and months, years to the point of Councilman McCoy. So I appreciate everything you do.
Thank you, Mr. Ainsworth. Nice to see you again. Other public comments?
Hi, Jane Snow. As you all know, I'm a data-driven person, and I do periodically take the time. So I took Ethan's most current report as of Friday and broke it down for you, and I'll read quickly. Ward 1 currently, according to that data, has 18. Ward 2, 29. Ward 3, 20. Ward 4, 7. 5, 1. Ward 6, 2. So that's a total of 77. And of that 77, 59 are not owner occupied. So that means 77% are not owner occupied. There's 61 people that have registered on Plum Island, 1 houseboat, 5 inns. And then there is a list of 13 that have at least two properties, and 1 particular person has 8. So I have a hard time introducing a business to residential neighborhoods. A lot of people are heavily invested to their home. That's their haven. And so when you bought in a residential neighborhood, you do not expect a business to be next to you. And I grant you, and I so appreciate all that Council McCauley has done. He's tried to find a healthy balance. But again, I am so concerned because I did have the experience of not having a good neighbor next to me with a unit. And you were left out on your own. And there is no data because when you went to report, you were told that it was a gray area. Were they breaking the law? Weren't they? And so nothing was collected and nothing. And I know people who sent in stuff, and if you ask, oh, there is no data. And then the other thing I have a question is I agree that licensing is a great way to go because I think it's a faster, more accurate way. And residents shouldn't have to pay a fee to go in front of the ZBA to address an issue with a neighbor not following the rules. And yet I thought about 8 versions ago, we couldn't do that with licensing. So if we could straighten that answer out for me, maybe since then the pendulum has swung again. But I think that this has been a tremendous amount of information for people to understand. And there hasn't been a lot of data collected. So maybe the best thing to do would be, and I keep saying this, is try it as just with the ones that are here as an experiment. That's all, because then it can be removed. Thank you.
Thank you. Other public comments?
Hi, my name is Teresa DePiro. I live at 53 Marlborough Street, and I own a STRU, single family, so I don't live in it. I guess to start, I do want to thank everybody for the time they put in here, but I have been to the same meetings my husband has been in the past, and it just seems so complicated. I read through this ordinance and the definitions are complicated. And I think when you're so deep into the detail of it, it's hard to rise above. And, you know, I think to rise above is licensing. I totally get that. I would like to license. I am licensed with the state and my STRU is licensed with the city. I'm paying the 6% tax of the city, which I probably think 5% of people are. Definitely bring the revenue in. As far as like, I'm in agreement with my husband, like I don't see the issues other than I heard about trash violations, noise, and parking. We only allow 2 people per bedroom, so 4 people. We have a driveway. I mean, we don't allow parties or events. It's my rules. I mean, I think at a city level, we could put these in, you know, 1 parking per. I think the different classifications of this are really confusing. I actually have been to committee meetings where I thought the committee members were confused. So I'm all for licensing. And I think if we look at a higher level and trying to limit parking and not allow events and have, you know, and have people licensed, and if they have an issue with their property, they have to, you know, they may lose their license. So I'm all for the amnesty, of course. And I think the people that are existing are good. I'm not hearing anything that's constant law breaking. And I just want to tell you that our place is furnished. So whether we rent it for a week, if we're not renting it, it's probably going to be a 3-month rental. We're getting the same amount of clients. I had someone meet today, it was a couple with their daughter and her mom lives, their mom lives here. They're from Michigan. I have someone staying whose family lives on Plum Island. So there's a need for this kind of housing and we don't have it right now. We don't have that need. And even with a hotel, we won't have that need. So I don't want it to be a business for everybody. I don't think 8 or 10, someone should own 8 or 10 of them and a corporation should own 8 or 10 of them. I just feel like it is a good need and there's people that want to come here for events and weddings and to visit their family and for birthday parties. And it's a great solution. So I think it could be regulated at a higher level with licensing and restrictions on that licensing. That's it. So thank you for your time.
Mr. Bureau, other public comments?
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Rita Mahalet. I live currently at 53 Warren Street here in Newburyport. This is a pretty compelling issue for me to come out tonight, and stand up before you on my tiptoes. Okay. I read over. I've been also out of touch with it for some time, but I tried to bring myself up to speed with everything I could see and read. And it's really too complicated for me to really zero in. So I'm just going to give you my overview. My perception on this complicated issue comes down to this. The residential market economy is under siege from the tourist market economy. I fear the residential market economy will suffer irreversible consequences if these boards, your board, people, you guys, doesn't adopt a strategy to keep our residential market economy thriving and thus our residential community from overwhelming tourist influx. I would like to see you ban all short-term rentals for tourism from the downtown, the north end, and the south end of Newburyport. I would like to see you diligently enforce that all residential short-term rental hosts are only renting out space in a housing unit that they own and live in full-time, meaning the host is present when the guests are there. I don't know about you, but my neighbors are also my friends. Neighbors, don't they play a pivotal role in your life, in our lives, and in our community at large? Airbnb landlords for, when they're in residential neighborhoods, they don't care about building community roots. They don't care about noise or safety or cleanliness for the people who actually live in these neighborhoods. They don't care about local schools or local governance for the good of everybody. They don't care about neighbors who now lost a neighboring family. All they care about is extracting wealth. I say these things because it's impacted me personally. I lived for the first 8 years here in Newburyport in a condominium on the south end, And after 5 years, some of my neighbors moved away and they sold, and buyers were invested in Airbnbs. So suddenly I had an Airbnb underneath me. Now, I know I just gave you a litany of, they don't do this, they don't do that. But worst of all is,
You're under the third 3 minutes already.
all right, I just want to say it changed the way I felt about my home. And I moved.
Other public comments?
So I almost didn't speak tonight because I feel like I've been speaking too much, but I just wanted to mention in terms of permanent housing availability in Newburyport, 59 mainland units not available is a lot. If you are on Facebook or Newburyport Next Door, you see the number of people who are trying to find long-term accommodations in this city, and they're not available. I appreciate the speaker who actually operates an Airbnb for saying that there should not be an excess of this use in Newburyport. There's nothing in this ordinance to prevent it, nothing. And in terms of some sort of defined list and record of complaints of people who have had to live next to problematic STRUs, I really don't think that's the job of residents to have to justify why they want to live next door to other residents. And I also don't think it's the job of residents to provide hotel space for the city. Jim McCauley has testified twice that the real problem in Newburyport for businesses is in the industrial park. That there are companies, he's spoken to the Chamber of Commerce, there are companies who simply will not locate to our business park because we do not have enough available permanent housing. And I'm not talking about affordable, although I think that's an assumption people have. Oh, it's the industrial park, those people must need affordable housing. I think that's elitist. I think people just need housing. And the law of supply and demand still works. If you eliminate available housing to high-end rentals, you are changing the economics of living here. And so I know I've said it many times. I think that we need to go back to the version of this ordinance, thanks to Jim McCauley, that was in place. in December 2021. I think that is the ordinance that provided some balance. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Thank you all. So I think at this point, I don't know, if the counselors on the committee and committee of the whole want to kind of state what they're feeling. I think maybe there's an assumption that council leaning one way or the other. I've not had any conversations with anybody, so I don't know quite where people stand or and same for the planning board. So how would we want to do this?
Well, usually we take the councilors first, so we might have them speak on their.
Okay, Councilor Khan is also here. I haven't seen you behind the plate, but if you want to, so we'll just kind of, just say where people are at and that will be good.
Right, thank you. So I think I went in many directions on this ordinance. A lot of it, full disclosure, I use short-term rentals when I go travel. So part of me as a user of them knows how my family acts and behaves. That doesn't mean everyone's like that, but I think that was part of my thinking is any travel I do, hotels out of the question because of the size of our family and the economics behind it. So I was trying to figure out what's a healthy balance here in Newburyport. I think what resonates to me the most is it's currently illegal. So as a city councilor here, I want to see something happen. So I don't want this to just to die. I do want us to get something in our table of use, and I recognize that. So with that said, the different iterations, and I don't want to bore everyone with my think pattern, but I did also look at all the research. I really appreciate the effort done by several people, but I also looked at the ordinances there, and it was mixed. Some just banned them in general, no short-term rentals allowed. And then some did the same model that we have before us. And then the other mix was to allow throughout the city without restrictions. So those were the three different styles. And I will tell you, I agree with the lack of having, I do not want a corporate owned type of facility because we did stay in one of those in New Orleans. And I will tell you, it definitely did not have a feel that people around you were appreciative as well. So no one wants to stay in one of those places and have people, neighbors, frowning at you or not happy that you're there. So I am totally in support of not having anything that's corporate run. I think the balance I was trying to find was, is there a way that owners would be resident only and they should be allowed to have one more location if that was something we could do? And KP Law's kind of verdict on that killed that idea. So where we are right now, where I feel is I'm very comfortable with what we have in place. I think it does make sense to start the way we have it, and if we learn to revisit the topic. But I will say that I am in favor of the amnesty provision. And the reason for that is I think the data behind what was presented by Jennifer Blanche was very compelling a little bit. You know, we heard 2/3 of the number. And again, we know the data is not completely there because it's whoever is registered. So we don't know what the full number might be. But the amnesty provision will provide, I think, the balance in terms of meeting what we have heard from those who are operating and are being good citizens. It's a matter of actually, let's see how this goes. And I am willing to do that and sit here and see what's the experiences. If we have on our website, a lot of communities have a very good website where they have listed the rules, they have listed transparently what needs to happen in a community based on licensing. And I think we would need to adopt something like that. So where I'm sitting right now is in favor of that amnesty provision and then keeping with what we have throughout the document in terms of the definitions on the owner occupancy, home share, and owner adjacent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The line I went next. Councilor Wall.
I just have a question. Do
Really close, council. Yeah. There you go.
Just a question for possibly Jennifer or somebody. So when you say the number of units is around 80 on the main floor, and then 2/3 of those are not owner occupied. Did I get that right?
Those are approximations, but
Approximate,
yes.
approximate, yeah, ballpark. Do we know how many are residentially or owned by residents versus out of the city?
I did go so far as to analyze that, but where we have been counseled by AP that we would not be allowed to restrict that, I did not bring that with me this evening, so I don't want to misstate it. I could go back and look at current data just to give you an answer, but I don't have it tonight.
Because when we talk about corporate owned, we don't like that, but is it because it's corporate owned or it's because it's somebody out of the city? I don't know if there is any way to differentiate.
I don't believe, based on AP's recent correspondence, that there is a way to restrict who owns it. You can say it needs to be owner occupied, or you can say it doesn't need to be owner occupied. But you can't say who that non-owner occupant can be.
What about an amnesty? Can you define, could part of the condition of amnesty be a resident, or is that's all?
That's all the same, unfortunately.
All right, I yield.
Can I ask a question that may be related? Are we be thinking that we could limit the number? So not whether they're resident, if they're a resident of Newburyport that owns it or not, but we could say nobody can own more than, so to speak. That would eliminate the corporate sort of.
I believe we can restrict the number that any particular individual can own, and that we could even do that under amnesty.
I would suggest that that be done in conjunction with the licensing division, as Jennifer mentioned.
Okay. I'll just kind of stay where I'm at. Thank you for those questions from Councilor Wallace and Preston. I'm comfortable with where this landed in May. I think there were a lot of changes made along the way. I know, some folks had a preference for CBA involvement, and that fell by the wayside. We did make adjustments at the end around the length of time for, during a year, how often a home share could be used originally. And home share, I still find these terms not consistent with my understanding of the English language, but home share is you're renting your whole unit. So you're sharing your whole home, I guess, is the way I think about it. Limited share is you're renting out an individual bedroom within your unit. So that's limited, I guess, and that makes sense. So you're, the limited share, you're there, and somebody's in your extra bedrooms. And when I look at the Airbnb app, which I've never used, but I've looked at a lot, and I don't think I've ever used Airbnb. Now that I think about it, I mean, there are a number of those listed in Newburyport, whether they're registered with the state or city, I have no idea. But there are a lot of renting out a room, private room. So though, to me, the home share. I go away to Florida, which I'll never do for now it's up to 120 days, and I rent out my whole unit, by the week to multiple people. That's now we're making that legal, and people will be able to do that. If I want to take in somebody for a weekend in my extra bedroom, I can do that. And again, I'd actually like to see us encouraging those sort of uses, because I think it does bring people in, and the owner, is still, able to supplement their income, and I think that's a good thing. The third category, the owner adjacent, similarly, it's somebody with a two-family and they're living in one side and they're renting out the other side for short term. And, you know, one clarification, and if I'm off base on this, please somebody tell me. Short-term rentals defined as 32 days and for a period of fewer than 32 days, right? So if I'm if we did not allow non-owner occupied, i.e. investors, to do short-term rentals, they could rent it out for 32 days, 60 days, 90 days, which kind of fills in a gap. I've been a family that in between moving in places in Newburyport where I've spent, 3 months renting out, an apartment, that happened twice. So those aren't anything that we're talking about restricting. So again, I'm comfortable with where we were at. To do the amnesty, the bigger that number is for non-owner occupied, i.e. investor, because that's an investment. The bigger that number is, the more I don't like it. Somebody said it was 15 at some point. Somebody said it was 12. I think kind of batting the numbers around that. If we could come up with a hard number of what that means, is it registering with the state as X date, and that's a small number. I might be amenable to that as an amendment, and then I vote for the whole zoning. But if the number is 59 that's owner occupied, that is a lot of units. And as counselors, I'm sure you've all heard from people that are looking for rentals in Newburyport. Next door, Facebook, you see this all the time. And we've lost hundreds of rental units in Newburyport over the last couple of decades. And, I think that for me, it's not as much the neighborhood quality of life. Noise is not good. Parking can be a pain. But it is pulling units out. And again, I made this same comment at a previous meeting. The council is going to help figure out with the mayor, how do we create some affordable units at the Brown School. And we're going to put a lot of time and effort, and somebody, probably a nonprofit developer in the state and federal government, are going to have to kick in some money to make 20 units affordable. And if we're, I certainly hope we can act because, if we did nothing, then this is only going to get bigger, and there would be more investment, people making money off of it, and that's great for them, but it's not good for the people that want to continue to live here. So I, again, I like where we were ending up in May. I'm open to listening about the amnesty possibility, but the bigger that number is, that would be harder for me to swallow. Check out. It's right now. Councilor Wright. Okay.
Yes, so thank you. So my thoughts are as follows. I don't like the term legal or illegal. It's either permitted or unpermitted. Legal and illegal is pejorative. It means they're doing something that's not permitted. So that's my preference. We talk about whether it's permitted or not permitted. Secondly, I'm very much in favor of amnesty. Whatever that number is today, it will never be more than it is today. It will always be less, because we'll be setting a date in time where those are now permitted for as long as they're in sane operation. And if they are out of operation, they'll no longer be permitted. So if there's a break in licensing and enforcement, then those units will never be eligible again for short-term rentals. The whole conversation around investment and owner-occupied, as far as I understand it, is that someone who owns the property or lives in the property is more likely to control their tenants than someone who doesn't. everything we do in the ordinance can either be successful or unsuccessful based on the way we enforce it. And so the big stick is in the enforcement. And if we don't do a good job on the enforcement side, then we're failing to provide the balance that everyone's looking for between the rights to have the short-term rental and the rights of the residential neighbors. So that will determine, in my opinion, and will identify good short-term rental operators and bad ones, whether they're residential short-term rental owner-occupied or whether they're owned by investors. The proof of the pudding will be in the enforcement. And so I would like to understand more what the licensing will be, because that should guide us on the ordinance side. But my hope is that the enforcement will on the licensing side will be swift, and it will be have teeth to it, so that if there are a number of complaints about the way someone's managing their short-term rental unit, then we can take that license away. And once we do, they won't be eligible for it until they, if they're an investor, that's gone forever. If it's owner occupied, they may be able to get licensed again, but I would think it would be very difficult for someone who has not performed as agreed to get licensed again. So those are my thoughts. Thank you for listening.
Before we leave, Councilor Wright,
Yeah.
could you clarify something? You said you were in favor of amnesty for existing short-term rentals. Did you mean
On investment ones.
investment?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
For existing investment ones. Yes, thank you.
Okay. For question.
I don't know if you pass it, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Connie Preston. So I have been, said this so many times, some of you may be very sick of hearing it, but I got married here in Newburyport, and that could have never happened if it weren't for the fact that we had short-term rental units. My parents, my sibling, and his family, my in-laws, everyone stayed in the short-term rental. We did have some friends that did B&Bs in town, and there was no way that they had the capacity to manage what we needed running. So I feel that this is very much a need in Newburyport. I personally come from a place where I would like to see a very broad ordinance with a licensure, and I feel that we could really manage nuisance properties through licensure. However, I am a realist, and I do very much believe that we do need to have some sort of ordinance in place. I think that the support for that does not exist. So what I would like to see is for us to have an ordinance with a very solid licensure process. I do believe strongly that special permits and the involvement of the CDA is not necessary, but a strong licensure process along with the amnesty for the existing units, whether they're owner-occupied, investment, whatever that may be. And then I would also like to see us put in a limit. I do firmly believe, I do not want to see corporations coming here. And, it's for my last reading of the data, there was a single person that had greater than 5. It sounds like that might be up to 8 now, I'm not sure. I think I would like to see us maybe handle that and maybe make that number more in the neighborhood of 3. I think that would allow for a very large number of the existing amnesty units to stay. But also, I mean, in the spirit of the fact of not allowing our community to be an corporate sort of investment community in these short-term rental units. So, you know, ultimately, I very much favor amnesty. I had hoped that we would have found the place with compromise previously, with allowing the resident owner occupied, or sorry, non-owner occupied, obviously that sort of went down in flames with the law. But I think that in lieu of that, the amnesty is a really wonderful way to keep the number of units that we have.
Thank you, Councilor Preston. Any other councilors want to make remarks? Let us know where they're at. Hearing none. So what would we like to do with this as a committee? We could. Sorry.
Those other people.
All these people around.
So inconspicuous in our silence. We're so inconspicuous in our silence until I speak to the microphone. So I would like to ask the planning board members if they would like to make any comments in addition to or reinforcing our recommendations to the city council from back in April.
What I see in this without an amnesty provision is essentially a ban on short-term rental units on the mainland. Looking at existing conditions, we have basically 18 owner-occupied units on the mainland right now. And of those, we can expect that probably at least half of them can't meet the parking requirements. So we're very close to, with the ordinance as it is right now, is very close to banning and outlawing all of the, well, not outlawing, making it impossible for almost all of the short-term rentals that exist on the mainland right now to be permitted. So to me, that says that this ordinance, which is a very complicated ordinance, could be made much simpler by just saying you can do it in Plum Island and you can't do it on the mainland. You essentially have the same result. So I do think that some consideration should be given to an amnesty provision. And then I don't know what that amnesty provision means, because does it just mean amnesty for investor owners, or does it mean amnesty from all of the other provisions and standards of the ordinance? So existing short-term rental units on the mainland that are owner-occupied but aren't providing the required parking, should those be allowed? So I think that's a big question. And this whole question of amnesty is a big piece that will need to have, if the planning board and the city council decide to pursue that, we'll need to have a lot of thought put into it to figure out how that moves forward. I also do think, I agree with some of the people who said that the licensing part of it is probably the easiest place to get quick enforcement of a problem. That you don't have the vesting or any question of a pre-existing non-conforming use under licensing the way you would with zoning. So it really would simplify the enforcement to focus on the licensing. But if we don't have the amnesty, if we don't have an amnesty and we have it the way it is right now, it seems like we're setting ourselves up for a lot of effort and time to essentially close down the 59 units on the mainland that exist right now. And I guess the question is that are all of those 59 units really a problem at this point? The final point that I want to make that I raised in the past that it hasn't been supported generally is I think that if we're going to allow it in the residential districts and the most of the business districts, we should be looking at some of the districts that have residences in them, where residences are allowed, but where short-term rental units are not being permitted by the current proposal. By that, I mean the agricultural conservation and the waterfront mixed districts, where it's sometimes difficult to see the rationale for why they're zoned WMU or WMD as opposed to one of the residential districts.
First point, I support what Rick just said as far as the zones where it's not permitted. I'm wondering if the city council is going to change the boundaries on those districts so that those houses are not included in the conservation districts or the waterfront marine district and the mixed use district. Because there are houses out there. I don't understand why those folks are being penalized with this ordinance. Otherwise, in general, I support the recommendations that we made before. I went back through the licensing part of it to see, and I see some conflicts between the licensing and the zoning as it currently stands. So I don't know if there's going to be additional drafting done to clarify some of these points. I hope there would be. I'm not sure what is planned. Specifically, under the section 9-304 in the licensing under exemptions, the language there, part A says a resident who rents no more than 14 days. Just to start with, I'm not sure that a resident is the right term that you want to use in that section, since we have the definitions for all the other technical parts of the operator and so forth. So I think there's a bit of a conflict there. That section though says that if they rent for no more than 14 days in a calendar year, they're exempt from licensing. But they still must submit certification and so forth, some other parts referred to in section 9-306, section F. But then later on in section 9-306F, it says the requirements the operator must certify that the STRU will not be rented for more than 14 days in a calendar year. And I don't see any limitation on that provision to say what type of STRU. So what that tells me is that no one needs to get a license because we're not allowing anyone to rent for more than 14 days. So I think that's probably a mistake or seems confused to me. Beyond that, under the 9-307 registration, I wonder if there needs to be a need to state when the STRU will be removed from the short-term rental registry. That talks about the
Chair, point of order. This is, he's going into a licensing agreement. This is for zoning. Can we stick to the zoning conversation, please?
Okay,
So we're, whatever happens with the zoning, then the other ordinance would get regarding licensing.
okay, that's fine. So it seems that some of those provisions are out of sync. In the zoning, it does talk about occupancy and use. The limited share has no limit on the number of days, and the other ones do have different limits and so forth. Yeah, so I just think we need to make sure that there are conflicts. My only other comment is that I know there were several comments on the language that was being removed from the zoning amendment where it said it was already covered by the licensing. However, there are many sections that are duplicates between the two, so I don't understand why some were removed and others were not. So I don't know if that needs to be tightened up. So yeah, that's my comments. Thank you.
Any other?
Yeah, how do I?
Yeah. let's see.
So my concern, well, I do think there is a need for this type of accommodation. In Newburyport, I too have stayed at plenty of Airbnbs
ones that are owned clearly by somebody who's just letting us borrow their house for the weekend, and then
Hold it closer to your mouth.
really investor owned properties. And I do think that there's a need for Airbnbs, short-term rental units. I guess my concern was what Jennifer raised about parking, and with what we have, that many of these units are not going to be able to be permitted. So I think that Rick's question about what an amnesty would protect is important. Whether we want to provide some protection for units that are operating that might not be able to fulfill parking requirements, or if we're just talking about investor problems. But I do see the need to, I think there should be an amnesty, at least of some sort, for investment properties that are currently operating registered.
I support the amnesty as a broad stroke, because I do think the licensing will correct any of the problems. One of the things that I had asked early on, and I don't know that we have records on that, is what the problems were. And I think that they were more isolated. So I think that whatever those problem properties are, those would self-correct through termination of licensing, and that could just, that it would not be granted in the future. I do have great concerns over dissolving short-term accommodations, which seems like that's what we're going to be doing. The reason is the downtown. I'm very fearful that we're going to impact our downtown and the restaurants that suffer. I do think we need overnight stays, and Newburyport does not have the hotels yet. I don't think they may be coming, but we're talking about today, and business owners in today. We've come out of a really tough climate these past 24 months, and I think that if we dissolve any percentage of these short-term rentals right now, we're very responsible for our neighbors who do own these businesses. And I think that that won't feel good. And lastly, my family, which is myself and my 3 children, we almost exclusively stay in Airbnbs. And I would personally never stay in one where the owner was there, not because we're problematic, but because my family time is so precious. And I don't have my children with me all the time, that I want privacy, and I want to enjoy the company of my family and my children. And I would X off an Airbnb where the owner was there for that reason only. So I struggle with lots of these variables, but my biggest concern truly is our community and what this will impact on our downtown if we dissolve these Airbnbs at any ratio.
First, let me say that I absolutely support the concept of short-term rental units in the city. I think it's a reality that we all have to face, and you know, we all, I think most of us are taking advantage of that. At the same time, I have been involved in this discussion since I've been on the board as of August of last year. And I will say that it seems that the conversation has moved from last fall, where the conversation focused on protecting neighborhoods, to a conversation now that is about protecting the short-term rental market and operators, potentially at the expense of neighborhoods. What I am seeing is that this is a market that is fundamentally commercial. It is driven by third-party participants, whether they are property managers, whether they are brokers, whether they are cleaning companies, maintenance companies. Fundamentally, this is a market that is being driven to growth by all of the parties that are involved. And Ms. Mahalick's comment about residential neighborhoods under siege, there is a potential for that. There is a potential for unfettered growth of a short-term rental market to just destroy the historic neighborhoods that exist on the mainland.
And I think we have to be very, very careful about that. One of the things that existed in the ordinance last fall and still exists to a certain extent now is a limitation on parking. And while I understand that might eliminate some units from consideration, I also understand that that was one of the mechanisms that controlled growth of the short-term rental market in these neighborhoods. And I think abandoning those aspects of the ordinance that control growth is asking for uncontrolled growth of this market in neighborhoods, because it is driven by businesses. It's driven by businesses who want this market to grow further. So I think we need to be very careful about relaxing the ordinance to the extent where you cannot control growth.
I'm the last board member to speak. I abstained actually from the vote on the recommendations because I had just joined the board. It was like my first or second meeting. After thinking about this more, I think I would support those recommendations now, with the caveat that I would echo some things that I've heard tonight. Zoning and land use generally is a very slow mechanism for regulating this. I do think short-term rental units are valuable. We should have some, but we should also regulate them and not have too many. And I personally have not figured out what that balance yet is. So I am encouraged actually most, I think, by, even though there's a land use aspect to this still, an increased focus on the licensing aspect, because I think that's a faster mechanism by which to regulate this, at least in part or in the majority. Because I think whatever the city council and others enact, we probably won't get it right first time. I think it'll need course correction as we go. So I think, being open-minded to knowing that it's not going to be right first time is probably a good perspective to have, so we know we can visit it. Because over time, we will get more data and we will learn more about the true impacts, negative and positive, over time that we're now trying to preempt, but with limited information. So those are my general thoughts this time. Thanks.
I'm actually the last one.
Oh,
Thank you.
sorry about that.
I want to build on what you said, Jimmy, because I believe also that we're not going to get it right the first time. We have lots of examples of zoning ordinances that we passed, that we learned over time weren't working exactly right, and brought it back to the city council through the same process and revised them. So I don't worry about getting it perfect the first time, because I know we can't. Secondly, I'm gonna leave all the other comments that I agree with or disagree with off the table. The only thing I want to focus on is the amnesty, which I do support in a limited way. And that limited way is that whatever regulations we decide to put into the zoning ordinance and into the licensing ordinance apply equally to the amnesty units. I don't want different categories of short-term rentals in the city. I think it'd be a headache to administer. It could lead into this time. I will use the word illegal use, and I don't want us to be looking at appeals and all sorts of messy situations. So whatever we put into the zoning and into the licensing should apply across the board with no exceptions. And in that way, I can accept amnesty for investor properties. I also like the idea that I've heard from several people to limit the number of units that an investor could own in the city. Whether it's 3, as Councilor Preston suggested, or some other number, it needs to be limited. Just say that. And that's what
Okay, thank you, planning board. So for the committee members, I'm not sensing a great urgency to vote. I think there's, again, more information discussed, and I think, certainly around amnesty, whatever the number, understanding the number of existing non-owner occupied investor rentals that are out there. The parking, which I thought we were in a better place, but it's now sounding that is quite restrictive, and that's something I want to get some real life examples of offline before I'm ready to vote on that. So I think we would, and if members want to add their comments, I think we would close the joint public hearing. This is still continues in committee as a committee as a whole, and we'll need at least one more meeting.
All right, so I'll make a motion to close the joint public hearing and keep it in committee in planning and development.
Second?
Motion made by Councilor Preston, seconded by Councilor Wallace. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you.
Well, I guess it turn to, and do we, this is a newly advertised ordinance. So it seems the planning board has to make a recommendation on this. And it could be to say, we could decide to just say we reaffirm our previous recommendation. But I think this is something probably we should do outside in a subsequent session unless we're ready to.
So why don't we leave it open?
Well, we can close the hearing, just again, discuss it at a future planning board.
Delay our recommendation.
Delay our recommendation. Not as long as that's time.
So do I have a motion? Do I have a motion to that effect?
I move to close the public hearing.
Okay, so the motion is to close the public hearing. Second,
Second.
all those in favor? Any opposed? We'll do that. Thank you, councilors, and we'll, maybe not, I don't know.
We'll see you again. I'm sure at some
On this topic,
Yeah.
good luck, and we'll be back in the.
Yeah, 90 days.
I like the best.
Let's hope we don't do this again. This is where it's coming. Can I ask, are there any the recommendations from the last time we played this game? Was it on the site development website? I looked around.
It's,
On the planning board's recommendations to us.
oh, sorry.
Yes.
It's entirely possible, I just.
April, it's April 6th, 2020.
April 6th, 2022 was the
The
date
date of our
recommendation report.
All right.
I will, so I'll ask them.
Okay, perfect.
Good catch, thank you.
It may not be.
It was only because I was looking for it, couldn't find it. There are so many things that I look for and
Yeah,
I
I
can't
just
find
see
it.
there, so.
So we need to have another. So we can just
Thank you
take
very much.
this and work from there. Let's put that on the agenda for July 6th. Return rental. Recommendation, discussions. Thanks. We
will move on to our discussion on Waterfront West. I think Jamie has been playing with the model for what very rough, what would you call that? Block diagram, nasty model looks like. So let's see what you've got and see where that fits with what people are thinking about since the last episode.
Sounds good.
Kind of show us what the model can do, not just what's in it.
Sure.
So we know what the technology might allow us to think about.
Just to preface this a little bit, I think the mission so far, trying not to have mission creep, but keep it incremental, was really just to explore what we could do as a board with visualization on our own steam before we brought in others. And then in the last meeting, so I showed still images of that in one session. And in the last meeting, we talked about, as a starting point for further exploration, having a rough massing of the two primary application schemes that have been presented. So that's what I have tonight, and I can do some show and tell on what the model can do. We can talk about some limitations of it. And then I would love to hear where the board thinks maybe we could go next. So to start with, the information all comes from the Merrimack Valley GIS system. And I've actually noticed some discrepancies, so I think there's some clarifications there, but they're all within the minor realm. And we're talking about kind of big moves, major massing. So I think for purposes of conceptual work, I think it's still pretty accurate. The area that's modeled currently is basically a large square that extends from Market Square to the top, at the top left. And it has roughly the Waterfront West area slightly above the center of the square. And obviously the big thing going from top right to bottom center is Route 1 and the bridge. And it's all very crudely modeled, but it's using the contours that are available that way. And then buildings are fairly precisely located horizontally based on that same data, but vertically, and we'll show some vertical elevations next, are estimated based on basically the number of floors, and if it's a short floor or a tall floor. So there's a lot more margin for error in heights, but we could refine that over time if we found that there were specific heights that were really critical to get more precise. So the first thing to think about is like how we're going to look at this. Is the existing site. So this is a kind of a common perspective view that's been shown in prior meetings. So kind of I'm going to show various things from this angle, and we can move around a little bit. But you can see the public waterfront area to the left, and the marina there, and Market Square to the left, and right in the middle development. This is a live model now, not still images, right? So within this, we can now start to focus on features. So one of the things, and I think I also caveated this, that I'm not the fastest person ever, but we can start to highlight, where things are a little more precise, and we can turn things on and off. So the first thing that we'll probably want to turn on is demolish some of the buildings that were gone in the first scheme and look at the first proposal. So this is roughly the first proposal that was presented. And it's not getting into the pitches and things like that, but the horizontal locations are very accurate and vertical elevations are somewhat estimated. That's an important thing. So I'm going to turn off some things as we go. So this has the ability to turn off certain parts and turn them on again. So you see a lot of horizontal lines in those buildings. Those are 4 feet, and that was useful really for construction. The contours that you see on the topography, so back in here, in the parking lot area, those are 2-foot contours. On the buildings, these lines are all 4-foot contour, 4-foot, basically 4-foot differences. But we can turn those on and off because they can be distracting, but they were very useful for construction. So that was the first application. This was the second application. So from there, we can see, pretty significant differences. We can go look in them. I wanted to show another one because this is something that Rick had shown. We can also get very precise now with some of these views. So, is this my screen? Oh, that's the screen. So you can see, I'm just going to rotate a little bit. City Hall is the large building there. And you can see this is the garage building. But these are, and then to the left, let's go this way. Again, I don't qualify that. I'm not the best operator for this. There's Michael's Harborside to the left. This is like the boat set. And so now I'm going to show you just a little bit more of like what this is capable of, so we can, we can turn things on and off. So I can turn off that, look at it as it exists today. We can even remove some of the buildings that would probably be demolished. So we can start to turn on and off things like that. We can really get down in here and look at specific views. We can get on the bridge and look back at town. We can do all kinds of things. One more thing I also want to show you, because this is, I think, where it could potentially go, although there'd be a fair amount of work to do it, but is in looking at this section. So this is hard to see because it's fairly crude at the moment. But if I put a little motion on it, it makes it easier to see. So what I've done here is sliced through the model now. And this model, this slice can basically go anywhere you want it to be to start to see the relative heights of different things. So we could start to look at more orthogonal views that way. And that's really with a mind towards creating, let's see, this, some of these kinds of diagrams where we really see with a little more precision the relative height between things. We could start to recreate some of these things with, big boxes, just, rough masses, no architectural details here. So I think this is where, I'd like to stop and see what people think. Bob and I discussed a little bit of like some of the ideas that we could start to explore, like moving some of these boxes around in terms of priorities of where massing could be a bit higher versus lower. But let's just pause at this point and see what.
Yeah, I'm trying to just ask some, I have no idea anything about this. I am interested in the heights, but I'm even more concerned about the topography. And so can you, in some iteration, show us both elevations and in relationship to the topography on the site, so that we're not just looking at a certain type of building without considering, oh, well, this one's on X elevation level and that one's on Y. And so they're going to have differences, not because of the absolute height of the building, but because of where it's located. That's what would be really useful, because once we can see where certain heights of buildings can be on this site, then we can propose that for whoever figures out the number of units that are there. Am I on the right track? I'm kind of saying this to see if I really understand where we're going with this.
I think that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at building height is, for example, at what flood elevation can residential uses start?
Right.
And so then you can look at a number of floors above that particular elevation. At what elevation can retail exist? So that's a different way of looking at it that separates the planning a little bit from existing contour. But it relates more closely to all of the flood.
I like that.
So that's the way I've been kind of thinking about it is where can I start residential?
Right.
And it might be I'm doing an upgrade, it might be that I'm excavating to create parking below or something, but I know I can start residential at a certain elevation. And I think so I think we can look at it any number.
That's the direction. I like it better because it's more specific to our concerns on zoning. Than just.
If you assume 10 feet floor to floor for a residential building, which is fairly standard, you can go a little bit more than that. That is an increment that you could start looking at in terms of overall building.
So I turned this on. It's the only, as far as we've gone with alternate massing scenarios. And this is one of the concepts that we floated in one of our meetings about a podium. That's at the 13th foot. That gets to the 13 feet. And this is really interesting to me because I've been playing with this model for a few hours and didn't really know what this was going to look like until I modeled it. With some precision vertically. It should, I don't want to persuade anyone with what it looks like, but I was surprised at what it looked like. To get a podium there at 13 feet. Before you put any buildings.
So I had to follow, I'm not sure it's actually following up what Bonnie's asked. So if we're thinking not just about buildings, but about the landform. How difficult is it for you with this model to show the road being lifted out of the flood? As we talked about on our sidewalk, to go up to bring the grade up 6 feet and then start, the buildings going up from there.
Not hard at all, because that's basically what I did. I think the challenge that I have, because it's my hand, and would want to be more collaborative than that, is where is the road? Some directions on where things actually are without designing. Because I don't want to design.
So if you took one of their scenarios, one of their applications, so okay, we have to bring the road up in order for it to be the road that they actually show on the plan to get it out of the flood. Out of the, not even out of the flood, out of the future high tide. That kind of affects, because it's sort of what Bonnie's saying in a way is it's the relationship not just of building to our current grade, but we have to think about what our future grade is going to be. And if you take 6, if you subtract 6 feet of building space, essentially, that kind of limits what unless you go up higher.
Right. So in other words, take that first application scheme, put the podium in and raise everything up by that amount, see what that looks like.
So by the podium, are you talking about? I thought by the podium that was sort of like the base of the building. That you're by podium, you actually mean how much fill is going in to make the road.
It could be either fill or a parking structure that is in that same location. I think those are two ideas that have been discussed. Either way, you're raising the buildings and putting something underneath it, right? Whether it's parking or
raising the land in front of it too. So it's not just under the building. I'm not so concerned about that. I'm really concerned about how you make this area resilient to sea level rise and how that goes, how that transition goes. Because you got right now, you've got the 2-foot contours. You can see that they're very close together near Merrimack Street, very far apart near the river. And if you actually make this more resilient, it's going to be closer together to the river and even further apart near Merrimack Street. You're going to get the steepness closer to the river and a flatter area near Merrimack Street in order for the whole, not just for the buildings to work, but for walking and driving and so forth.
Yeah, so we could illustrate a berm, basically, of varying widths along the river. Yes, we could do that.
So related questions, and maybe this is sorry, change this account, but are the buildings actually extruded off of topography? So it's a little bit of a supplemental Rick's question, Bonnie's question, but assuming that you have, either the plan committee D or someone that's a sketch plan here in the West, you're able to adjust the turbo to deal with where we might go, taking out of the future sea level rise, for instance, like you just talked about. But are the buildings now, or would you be able to sort of extrude them essentially out to 5 meters of Barnes question? You'd want to see a 3, 4, 5-story building in relation to grade, might look different, higher in Merrimack Street because it's actually grade. So I just don't know whether that's something that you're doing in blocks or whether or not it's actually extruded off of the 5 meter.
Yeah, so one of the things you could do, this as an example of what I think you're talking about, is you could take some of these, and I'm not gonna be quick with this because this goes beyond, but you can make some of them taller, right? You do this kind of thing, which I think is what you're getting at.
Right.
Some could be taller, some could be shorter, which I think is one of the comments we had was like, this was monotonous, they're all the same, so we could start exploring that. It's not exactly what you're saying because you're talking about grades as well, so
Right. Is that harder for you to sort of like, for instance, obviously you adjusted layers to use for turbo, for instance, but is it hard for you to manipulate the ground level? Maybe it's easier for you to work with building height elevations in this model than it is to extrude and bury the land, or is that?
They're both possible. I guess one of the things I'm curious about now that I've been thinking about this three-dimensionally more than others, at least recently, not in the past, but at least in the last couple of weeks, is, like, are we shooting for a maximum height from a visual perspective from off-site? Or are we just going to try to, like, what's the strategy? Or are we going to try to craft a policy where it's like, the building has to start at some point, and how much more are we willing to give above where it has to start because of resilience, and maybe maybe we need to approach it from both ends and see where it meets in the middle.
It seems to me that that's been the issue since 2017 or earlier in the discussion, is the fact that civil rights, we need to see adjustment for that, but we also were trying to, I don't know if it's the court or others, but it seems as the community has wanted to look at vantage points, not only on the site, off the site, used to the river, maybe it's one, but other vantage points as well, and basically balancing those with the need to address civil rights. So that's not to say that everything should just be extruded on top of that for buildings. I think that would be inappropriate. But to figure out across the site with those vantage points, then what I said earlier, what is appropriate in sort of not having this 5-story mass across every building, or but actually having a variation of that, which also I think adds to the experience.
I would say that, that this is, from my point of view, this is the least important kind of perspective, like a distant perspective, and kind of skyline. It's more important to me, what's it like walking through the site, what's it like going down Merrimack Street, what's it like looking from Merrimack Street down to the water. It's kind of a close up, close and personal experience rather than a distant view.
In the buildings, yeah, and on the streets.
You actually, when you started off, you said something about vertical being maybe not as exact as the horizontal. You were talking about the existing buildings, right? But you've got pretty good, these proposed buildings or hypothetical buildings are actually measured.
Yeah, so existing buildings, which are the gray buildings, are very much approximated based on the number of stories that I can see in the street view. These could be closer, but I candidly, because there's still some margin of error in the other buildings, I haven't gotten to precision on these. I think they're within, half a story maybe, but they're not.
The plans actually have numbers on them.
Yeah. But there is a discrepancy, and this is actually something, if we're gonna get down to feet, because the GIS system has most of that property at 6 feet. And so I need to clarify some things about the survey and what's a GIS, because if we're getting down to an increment of 2 feet, we might have some technical issues. I think in terms of like 5 feet, 10 feet, it's pretty good. Getting down to 2 feet, I think we're getting probably a little too precise.
Depending on how much time you want to spend or something else you want to spend on this, we do have an existing conditions plan that if someone wanted to sort of, I don't know if we can get the CAD plan first yet, but to take the topo line and try to work out with that with a little more accuracy than 2 feet. But again, it goes to how much time is spent to create them all.
Right, and what are we really, because I don't think we're trying to design the site, we're just trying to put some basic parameters on the envelopes of buildings that we think work. One more thing I'd like to say and show, I think I have it here. Yeah, it's not just heights. We talk a lot about heights, but we could explore also. So what I did was I took that the boat sales building. I'm sorry, I don't know the actual name of it, and I copied it 3 times to put more of it. So we could also explore a variety of buildings too, like maybe, more massing in the center and taller buildings where it can tolerate it, but, breaking it down along the water's edge, in addition to all the grading stuff that we're talking about, but maybe it's even 2 different zones that feel different, we could explore things like that as well.
Around the embayment, we've got a bunch of trees. Are those just things that you just copy and paste and they're?
Yeah, but there's very little precision here.
Well, I'm just wondering whether you could put those into the plan as well.
Of course, and cars and people, I was struggling with what could give this scale, because like this, it's really hard. So here's a cluster of people that you can see. I was gonna start sprinkling around, but we're looking at this as such a.
In the front on the right.
There's Rick right there, yeah. We're looking at this as such a, a macro scale. It seems as kind of silly to start working at that level yet, but that, adding things that give it a sense of scale beyond just boxes, since we're not going to design the boxes with windows and eaves and cornices, could really help give it some scale.
Because when I was looking at the plans that was submitted to us, I was questioning whether they were realistic, because they showed trees, but I didn't think the trees could fit where they were. It was like the scales weren't correct. And so it would be nice to, obviously we're nowhere near that. But at some point, if we're talking about space in the buildings, it's going to be interesting to know whether those buildings are spaced to be just buildings or there's room for other stuff.
Yes, Bob asked me, the widths of these buildings, these are now measurable. You can take a tape measure. This is the tape measure tool. You can measure the widths of these buildings. So they were under 60 feet. And there were separations in this particular scheme between buildings were under 40 feet.
This scheme is the, 2017 or so plan that we saw from the Newburyport development, right?
Correct. I think this was the very first.
Yeah.
Submittal.
Okay.
To your point, I think rather than looking at building width, if we said a pedestrian passageway has to be a minimum of 40 feet wide, and we wanted to accommodate that. I think we can begin to set recommended dimensions for that. Create the character of those vehicles. Some can be purely pedestrian. Some will require automobile and pedestrian. So I think there's potential for a variety of kinds of spaces, so we can get cars into park somewhere on the site. But I think those are the kinds of dimensions that we should focus on, because we want to accommodate landscape.
I can't quite tell or recall how far out you've modeled. Do you have State Street or Pleasant Street? And the reason I'm asking is I had, or even Water Street, or Merrimack Street there. I had done a very conceptual study of the width of that compared to the height of the buildings there. And if you have it in model form, it'd be really nice to see that comparison compared to the height, so we know how trees fit or don't fit along those existing streets.
So I have to, it's just like the first 8 feet of State Street here.
I think it would be useful to compare it to something that everybody knows.
60 feet, give or take.
Whether it's State Street or Pleasant Street or lower or Merrimack adjacent to these sites.
But clearly at State Street it's interesting to think about that. The State Street, you don't need that because you're not going to have parking on both sides of the street. You're not going to have 2 4 lanes. So it's really interesting to think about what you can fit into 40 feet as opposed to 60 feet.
Right. Very useful.
I don't know if this is a crazy idea. I am so resistant to modeling, even for practice purposes, which maybe we've already over anything that NED gave us before. It feels like we're tying ourselves to something that we don't want. So I'm wondering if, or what information you need. I may have asked this question before, but we're more in a position now to be able to try to answer it. To block out the space for open space and for buildings. Generically, now we're not going to design it, but we need to do that to understand what we should put into the zoning, right? That's what this is all about. This isn't to show everybody what we'd like to see as a proposal from the applicant. It's just a tool to get us to the numbers on the page that are going to turn into an ordinance. And it helps us and will help everybody else to visualize what we do. So the idea that we don't have too much detail is great. But so far, everything that people have suggested would add to the overall scenario. And I'm just wondering if that scratch as opposed to building.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, I feel like part of that is an iterative process because you have to define public space in some way. And so it might be hard for Jamie, for instance, to, allow sort of randomly picking where building footprints are going to go. To me, there's one benefit, for instance, like the boat actually plaza or piazza or whatever they call it from the NP plan. To me, that I feel like it could be a successful space there with the sort of wraparound of building, regardless of the details of that way. It could be a successful space, but without having some sense of what the public realm is going to look like, there might be east-west connection, we don't certain hardware, right? But beyond that, unless Jamie's got some direction as to where he's putting building footprints or the sizes of them, it's hard to otherwise just sort of randomly doing it. You wouldn't necessarily want to show masses without the development or creation of public space, which is a little bit there.
So this is the dilemma. We're not going to design the whole thing, and yet we need a design to get a sense of the massing. So someone help me, please.
I think rather than focus on the buildings right now, I would focus on connections, circulation. I think we think that Market Street, for example, should extend into the site, and that suggests that that's a place where automobiles may enter the site. The existing condominium building, that street there, that's access to their parking. So that connection has an automobile component. There's already automobiles over by the Tustin Sea Grill, and there's the beginning of a connection for cars coming parallel to the waterfront that way. So there is that potential. I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but there's that potential. And then in between, starting to get to these kind of 40-foot dimensions and what we want to see for the scale of a pedestrian. In between those are perhaps the pedestrian connection street down to the road. And that starts to build a kind of master plan framework for this that makes the kinds of connections that you want to see happen. Then the buildings can kind of fill in an obvious way around that. But I think you need to start with something like that and work your way into what that means for the public realm. Where are the focal point spaces? Where do we want to collect people along the waterfront? Those are the kinds of decisions you can make that don't lead you into designing the building.
I think those are good points, but just in support of Jamie, what he was illustrating there was what we were kind of talking about in our walkthrough, having the buildings run that way, feeding down. So there's a little bit of a notion that that's kind of what we were trying to visualize when we were walking through.
Yeah, because I think that is the right start of the diagram. What he drew there. So I actually took a screenshot of it. But I think we would also probably all start to agree that any of those blocks are still too big. They need even more definition. They need to be broken down further than that.
I think, I guess that's one place where you're probably right, but from a community point of view, what I think is important, you just drawn the map, places that people are going to experience, go through the site, join the site, and with the addition of plaza or whatever, and that has to be figured out in terms of what it's going to be active boat launch area there as well. But to me, once you figure out the resilience piece, and you figure out these major circulation piece, then everything else almost gets left up to the designer, project designers. It's
But
not-
then
that's
there
not
are
a-
design guidelines.
What's that?
Then you have design guidelines.
Right, but I mean, to a certain extent, if those are all private routes, if they're not something that the public is necessarily going to experience. I don't, I mean, it's more a matter of what does it look like from the outside? Me, because I don't want to be trying to create design guidelines that are going to hamstring the developer. Anyway, I think what I'm saying is I think these 4 linear routes are really the key things.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Andy nailed it.
I would even get rid of the one on the left.
Well, I would get rid of the horizontal one.
Oh, no.
Because I don't want that for vehicles.
Oh, no, but we need to get in, if there's gonna be something happening.
It could be public space, not for people.
Yeah,
Right.
Oh, okay. I thought when you drew that one, I heard.
No, sorry, I was actually thinking not just about what might be for vehicles, but actually.
Oh, that's fine.
sheds
It's
and-
important circulation.
Yeah.
Bonnie, that's one of the fundamental decisions. Do you want to allow cars to the water? Do you want to allow cars access to the marina?
You can have access, but
How does
just,
all of that work? Does that make it a kind of working, accessible waterfront, or do you want to keep cars off? That's a decision.
Yeah, I know.
that we can make.
but we had already talked about, and not that we've made any decisions, that the access for vehicles would be off Merrimack Street and not across.
Not completely in conflict with the public space, right?
Well, I think,
So that could be controlled, whereas if you had cars coming all the way across, you run into conflicts with pedestrian rights.
I think there's lots of ways of looking at this. One way of looking at it is that it's a district. And there are small blocks and there are properly scaled streets. And there's, perhaps there's a waterfront street and you limit parking there, but you do allow cars to pass through that zone, and that makes it kind of a legitimate, waterfront zone. Yeah, I think there's lots of ways of looking at it. One of the things you might hear from the development, and might hear from their architect, is retail kind of thrives on visibility, and restaurants thrive on visibility. So, part of that comes from cars and being able to loop around and drive through this district. And, we have to look at what that means in terms of, the scale of it. Do we really want that to happen? But if the idea is to put retail down on the waterfront, and the retail over by Tuscan Grill is accessible, from the parking lot, and it's visible, as you park your car. It's tougher to make retail work when it's isolated and not as visible. So these are things we have to think about. It's sort of looking at what are the characters of all of these different connectors.
There's also the
And
practical.
that's partly why I keep talking about precedents. And, what are examples of other successful waterfronts? And if you look at Newburyport, places like that. Ours are all over the place. But it's considered a very successful waterfront zone. By the way, there's a terrific new hotel in Newburyport called Hammonds, which you should all look at. That is on the waterfront, has parking underneath, has a deck at an elevation where they look out over the wharf zone. It would be a wonderful example of something to. So we should be looking at those kinds of things.
That is a particularly good example, whether you love it or hate it, it would be really useful for discussion because it's a real life example of something that's kind of along the lines of what seems almost inevitable for this portion of this site.
We're a tool.
And it's just a certain point, but That's clear.
So what would help, what do you think? we should do? What kind of discussion should we have?
Well, I'm trying to hold back my instincts as an architect and not design.
Well, no,
That's very challenging for me.
That's why. I'm wondering.
Yeah, but I think we need to stay diagrammatic for a while with it. I like this diagram. I like what Andy drew on there. I mean, maybe look at 2 or 3 versions of this diagram. Might be the next step, right? And talk about the pros and cons of those diagrams before we go much further with actual massing.
Yeah.
Because I think the massing might respond to the use more than we think. We've talked a lot about height, and I know the public meetings were all about height, but if it's more focused on the use, and the height kind of follows that.
Well, I think you have to be careful because at least on the Merrimack Street side, I think you've got to cap it. You're not going to go higher than what's there. Pretty sure. So that's going to be sort of setting those buildings there.
This one right here.
No, the one in the middle.
Here.
That-
Yeah, that's it.
Because I think the one on the right is shorter. But I think that's going to be, that's kind of giving you your ceiling, and what happens as you go down the slope. Is where all the controversy or discussion or negotiations. And I think this really helps because you've got that elevation. I don't think anybody's proposed anything higher than that. But AD's proposed anything.
I don't believe
Really
they're
higher.
higher.
That's where that's sort of a point of agreement there.
I mean, I would be devil's advocate. I mean, what if you got more height in the middle, but you could free up and have really low rise stuff all along the edge? What if that was a really nice?
Low rise up on Merrimack?
Yeah, or no, along the waterfront and Merrimack, around the perimeter, basically. Think of it more like a.
Well, I don't think we need, that's a big discussion. I don't think we need low rise in Merrimack Street because we're beginning to develop between parking garage and the new buildings being computed on Market Street. We're beginning to get that kind of sense of urban height.
Well, let me be more specific because one of the things that I think we've talked about is an incentive for a hotel, right? And so like whatever envelope we might come up with, we might think of an incentive bonus for a hotel. So where would you want that to be,
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that, and if you do that, I think that should be very defined where that is. You don't want to have a bonus for a hotel that's allowed anywhere on the site.
Right.
You want to have a specific location.
right.
Yeah. I put it there.
Would something, I mean, possibly, I don't know how much time do we have, this very one thing that might be helpful is, do we work with a diagram like this? We talk about what are the vantage points of pedestrian spaces, and so we're trying to define that realm, so that back into buildings themselves, a massive right like that. Or do we send, sketches to Jamie and say, oh, here's an alternative to what we saw in maybe in terms of layout, the plaza, because remember the first second plan that Jamie had there, this illustrating was Andy's original plan was just a bunch of buildings, fingers from the water's edge, which doesn't create any public space whatsoever, just on cars going around the building almost. So by working with that discussion that happened with Jeff Spag and the charrette type discussion that happened there, they resolved to have a plaza created and the harbor walk was sort of creating a better space. I do feel like the other area over here wasn't been neglected, and I think that this is added to the mix, that makes it easier to kind of bring it into the fold. Because this area, I think of that plan, if you're all familiar, they kind of trail off and didn't quite define public space quite as well as I would say this space did. So maybe that's something we can work on before, but that was, buildings or extrusions that you're done during this modeling are actually, they always in our discussions creating a public space that would be something we want to see or is viable in some way. Like this, where you have the definition of public space. So.
that's a really, that's, I was sort of imagining that image from the strategic plan as we were talking about these
Yeah,
major routes. I think it's almost like.
that's the
We
diagram.
don't have to reinvent the wheel, it's already there.
Right, so this was actually maybe next on my to-do list, is model this, you know. Because I think there have been a lot of good ideas. I think that, and frankly, I might be the minority opinion here, but I think there's some good ideas in NED's first proposal. I think it lacks some creativity in some areas. It wasn't sold very well, but there were some really nice aspects to it. There's some really fantastic aspects to this. So like, we don't have to necessarily start from total scratch, you know?
That was a really great plan. I think it would be fun, you know, when he mentioned sketching things up, I think it would be if we had plan view of what you have with all of the existing buildings removed. What are we doing?
That's what I want to start from.
And just take away, take away the.
That
every building.
represents realistically represents the site.
And actually, I'm not sure you actually have the. Yes, you did, okay. Here you go. Screw those buildings. And it gives us, that's our blank slate, literally.
And this you calculated was approximately 6.5 acres, right?
Yeah.
Is that jive with what you know?
That's out of right, yeah. It wasn't-
We said it's not 8 acres.
Not 8 acres, no. Yeah, I think that might have been thinking of the entire district, which is, that would make more sense for water and Western Village District as a right. Yeah.
So we're talking about 6.5 acres of developable space. Well, it may not all be usable, but it's land area.
Right, because this area right here is marsh, there's a good chunk of this.
Right.
That's not developable.
It really is, it's interesting. It's the variables, you know, I look at the site and say, well, as is, a lot of it's not usable because it's going to be underwater. But we talk about raising it up so it's not underwater. It changes everything else.
I mean, I'm curious what people think the three options there are that I can think of, there may be more, but the three main ones would be make a bathtub, like build a ring around it and build whatever you're gonna build in the middle. The other one is to fill the site to an acceptable height with just dirt and then build on top of that. The other is, you know, build a sacrificial layer or a layer that's designed to put like parking or retail. Another idea that Bob and I talked about is like, what's interesting about a scenario like this. So I tore down one of the buildings, the big one on the end, because I think that was probably one of the more offensive buildings, right? These little wood frame buildings could get lifted over time. And lifting a wood frame building is surprisingly inexpensive. It could be this. There are other scenarios too.
I'm wondering if you can discuss with that represents in civil rise, and one thing we can do is working with, you know, John Arco's discussion earlier today is to give Jamie, you know, the data set or the something there for civil rise, have that shown in the model. I don't think it shows almost like a transparent, you know, sort of extrusion, right? Literally showing, you know, and that way, actually, for our discussion purposes, we're keeping that in mind as we think about, because that's the ground level pushing up versus the height concerns that all.
It really has it because it's 4 feet to 6 feet, right? So it's above existing. So.
Right.
So, you know, the sea level high tide is 4.7. And so future high tide is either 8.7 or 10.7. And you've got the contours.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Designing anything because take civil rights consideration. That was the big thing because prior we didn't have any of that with any of the other NPD ones. That's one of the big problems I have with that. Anyway.
And then the other thing, in terms of your question about the three options. the sacrificial layer is always bothered because it seems like it's fine for the short term, but in the long term, if you're walking down the street, the storefronts are all empty. I don't know.
Well done, I'm sure noticed.
So what's that?
That's 13 feet.
That's 13, what's 13 feet? 13 feet is what?
Above mean high tide, I think.
Oh, so high, so this is a little higher than, right?
So it's just 100-year flood?
This is the 100-year,
Oh, yeah, so I was thinking about daily, I was thinking of daily tides.
which is what, 8?
We're 4.7 now, so you'd make it, so say 5, you'd make it 9, 4 feet if sea level rise is 9, and 6 feet by the end of the century is 11.
So down 2 feet.
That's
Didn't change much.
So now if you zoom in and sight, you kind of get an idea of like.
So how much filling you get above high tide?
Right.
So this podium right here, so that, remember I did this podium,
Stays above.
stays right above, right at it. That was what that was trying to illustrate.
But
That's
I
pretty
guess
crazy, actually.
it's almost a mapping it almost becomes irrelevant because you have to fill up, you have to fill them up. Make it useful.
That tells me I don't want to build anything.
But yeah, I mean, when
Puts
you
me
look
out of
at,
a job.
when you look at the,
For 2 minutes.
We
Ring of honor.
when you look at the map from 1894, and you see that water was lapping in Merrimack Street in 1894, and we filled all that. Made it into a beautiful park, parking lots, places for buildings to be. So it's, they could do it in 1894, they could do it in 2090.
It's a lot
The
more,
environment hasn't changed.
better do a lot more film than suggested. 6 feet they were put in there.
No, this I think this is appropriate. This is what it is. This is 6 feet.
Yeah, the difference, I guess, with the NED, the sketch plan we talked about with NED a couple years back was that like they were tapering that property line.
Tapering the end.
Whereas what he's got here just for illustrative purposes, like pointing across the site,
That's
right? Yeah.
But then we have to worry about runoff. But
We're not gonna have to worry about runoff because waterfront park's gonna be underwater, so we're just flowing.
It's 11.
I was just reading today about, in the Arab Emirates, they have already built whole parts of cities
Artificial island.
on artificial land. I think we'll be out there, but they got nothing to do with their money. Send it over here. Oh, and they're planning more.
Maybe we should bring here.
They're building expensive houses now.
Yeah.
So they.
So, we should do different scenarios, but the Phil one seems to be. Phil ought to be one of them, produce a sacrificial and then.
That's what they say, in the Netherlands, they go all parking under the canals, under the rivers. We can't do it.
Yeah.
No.
I mean,
We can't
I'm
take-
thinking about Phil being so expensive, forget about it.
No, but if you feel, I mean, this gets back to the podium, I think, so if I'm understanding it, correctly, if you build up the podium and you have parking underneath the podium. And you have it, that's the bathtub.
Right.
Yeah.
This is the water at 11 in the podium here.
And you have some way to get down under that 13. Right, right.
It's kind of a shocking image.
Yes.
It's bringing us right back to 1894.
Yeah, and there is, I don't think we should be thinking about financial feasibility at this point. So you say the data is available to model these two scenarios? Well, no, actually, it's off of the sheets we have right above us. Those contour maps and the latest one you sent us was this one I couldn't read.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not even, that's just, I think that's 27 or something like that. This is 21.
But even, yeah, even 2 feet down from there, just look at that, 9 feet versus 11. Doesn't change
Yeah,
much.
that's it. That's it.
It didn't change much. I mean, a little bit.
It's because it's so steep going up and down.
These islands pop out.
Yeah.
That's the berm, right? Right, so do more of these, that's, you know.
Sacrifice the test.
So where are we going next?
I thought we were going to be, one suggestion was to just sketch out ideas.
That we react to the have.
So us sketching out our thoughts.
Yeah, I just, hopefully minimizing that to something going to the fair James time, and that would give some James something to do for alternative community plan here, right? Yeah. I'm sure there are a couple of other examples that we can pan around and see how does that affect the massing of the visual space, the heights, and visualize.
I'll be the first one that I haven't had those sketches.
Well, I'm thinking, it's really, that's.
Yeah, I've been coming back around to this, like, I think it's great, it's fantastic. It incorporates so much of what we're already saying.
Model that one,
Yeah, I would,
use that as a starting point.
yeah, I think this is.
I think it's, yeah. So that plan led to, or that sketch led to more detail, like with buildings, showing the buildings, courtyards, and everything like that, in the same report. And I think that was the issue. Going from here to that more detailed plan was the place where human development said, it's not because of this buildings, it's got those small blocks, and everything.
Right, they didn't make small buildings and those little squares, but for the smaller walkways, it's feasible.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Which is why
so
they have new plans, much bigger mass.
this framework would more work for them than the detailed plan that just would work. I think that the trap or whatever it is, the strategic plan, which I love, was trying to mimic the scale of historic. And doing a development doesn't have to get more to do that, bigger. And probably because of all the costs, the site costs. So it's if you look at I think we almost have to end up accepting the fact that what is there is not going to be in any way like historic Newburyport. It's going to be a much larger scale, just because of the economics of building. But if we keep this framework intact, that will get us a lot of what we want.
Well, it's interesting to say activities in the 3 Market Street, right? That is a building that's,
That's a nice, yeah, but I think they don't have the same site costs that you do get close to the water. I think that's what the issue is. And when the development doesn't think that small.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking of it more as an entity or scale thing, as opposed to it's not feasible.
Right.
Doing multiple 2 actually. Maybe this is sort of where it does become feasible, it may not be a significant financial benefit to them. But there's something that's maybe viable in there.
You're right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's true.
The other thing is, and this is back to design issues, you can have the feel of small buildings with larger buildings by breaking it up, by having open spaces through them. I'm looking at, different examples of big buildings that feel small, or take advantage of, adapt to windy situations in addition to water situations. Parts of the world. Yeah, that.
So this is the Hammond Hotel Bob mentioned. I actually stayed there last summer right when it opened. I was thinking about this at all.
Exactly what I was thinking.
It's really nice. And I actually just found another image, which is not the more attractive side of it necessarily, but shows you how it works. There's this elevated platform, which is a great public space. The whole thing is parking underneath.
Yeah. That's it. And a lot more building. Normally would imagine it's just boxes. That sounded like Bob. Design of it.
This feels like a much smaller scale.
It's maybe 25% of the scale of the rest.
Well, that was what I was going to point out. When you look for comparisons, there are pieces that you have to put together that will come to ours to make it total. We're not going to find something exactly like ours.
Maybe getting to give more, something that's more of a festival marketplace kind of thing, you know, like a multiple waterfront or something like that, where you have this lower scale, it's got a lot more open space, and so it doesn't feel as dense as the center. But it doesn't, again, it doesn't meet their
And the thing is that like the Baltimore waterfront is,
yeah.
you know, it's space.
Yeah.
We've got a really constrained space. If they want, you know,
Right.
densely.
I can't stop them.
Yeah, there you go.
I can't stop them from moving. It's a movie.
It's great, good. Oh, you know, that's this. Yes, that's this.
Yeah, it's great.
All of these are great,
One
yes.
of those.
I'll take all of them. I don't think they want to go.
Yeah, I encourage anyone to go see it in person.
No, I agree, but again, I don't think, you know, that's, we're dealing with a very different piece of land. Very nice.
Well, I mean, it occurs to me, I mean, there could be, I mean, if you really wanted to look like a downtown that grew over time, a part of town that grew over time, instead of just popped up like a big Disney World park. No, it should have some variety in it, you know, I mean, this could be one of the 4 major buildings, you know, not the whole thing.
And I could see this, to your earlier point, I could see this as fronting on the wharf street, you know, that street that goes parallel to the water. And then having that taller, denser building kind of hidden behind it, so you can't really see it walking through, because it's set, the higher building is set back, it's, you know, blocked by a setback. So you can actually get that density, as you said, of 4%.
Bob and I are gonna have a hard time not designing this.
Do it. Well, you know, that's, if you have, it's not so much design, it's not just coming up with kind of concepts for the design concepts, for how to structure, to guide the development. So you're not designing it per se, but coming up with this is a great, really good lesson. You find other ones. Sure, you find other ones too.
Yeah, and maybe if there's a homework for others is if you see an image or
One of
two
the
of
ones that
something
I
else.
don't know, did you see the memos that I did? And I pulled one, there's one Portland that along the riverfront that I use as an illustration.
Portland, Oregon. I remember you saying it, but I don't know if I saw it. Do you recall me?
I'll get it for you. It's one of those things where it's a 2-story building along the river, but there's a high rise tucked behind it. I mean, you know, set back.
You know what I could do? Because this isn't designing, it's like playing with Legos a little bit. Is if we had 4 or 5 projects we liked, we could put them on this site.
Yeah.
You know, we could put the Sydney Opera House on the site, like my earlier joke. But we could really show.
Yeah.
And then we could mash up 4 or 5 of them and see how they look together, you know. then we're not designing, but we're like taking other case studies and seeing
You
how
can
they
even
work.
take Merrimack Landing, what's it called, Western Firehouse? And
Oh, yeah, the Arsenal building.
yeah,
Yeah.
you can take that, pick it up, put it in. That would be that's 10,000 square feet of commercial space.
A local example.
Yeah, a local example.
Which was that?
The building is right across from the firehouse. It's a long building.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
Parking lot.
Yeah. Yeah, so if people want to shoot me an email with a project they like, I can model it. That's actually easier to
That
do
would be really, that would be
than
great.
creating
Because then
something
you
from
think about
scratch.
how does it actually work? Does how I imagined it fitting
Yeah,
in the waterfront actually fit?
and then we can even move them around, rotate them, we can lift them up and down.
Everybody gets their favorite building, put on the site. and see.
Don't do that night.
Yeah, mountain chalet or something. Good, thanks.
That's great.
So I want to tell you something now, Laura, we're still being recorded, so it's fine if anybody hears this, but maybe I won't say. I'm sorry.
Was that a motion to adjourn?
That was a motion to adjourn, yeah. May I have a motion to adjourn, please?
So,
Thank you, Rick.
Second.
Second, all those in favor?
I.
All right,